Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here with you today. It's my first time at AAS, and it's my first time to participate in a TEDx event. What I'd like to do is, in 18 minutes, tell you as much as I can about the things that we're doing on the International Space Station right now, and why I think it's important, not just for us that fly in space, but for those who will fly in space, but more importantly for all the people that live on planet Earth here. So this is a little bit about my background. I started out as a Coast Guard helicopter pilot and engineer, and I've done a couple of shuttle missions, and I've had the great good fortune of spending 6 months on Space Station doing the research that that magnificent facility was designed to do. I took a couple of years and taught at the Coast Guard Academy between my shuttle missions and my 6-month Space Station mission, and now here I'm currently in Star City in Russia, working as NASA's director out there. These are some of the things that I think make space station and space station research important. Space is a really difficult thing. It's very difficult from a technology standpoint. It pushes all the boundaries of science and engineering to be able to do the things that we do up there. We learn a lot about the Earth. We learn a lot about space. We learn a lot about our bodies. We learn about basic and applied sciences. We learn about combustion physics, fluid physics. It's a great opportunity for us to develop new technologies. We've got to be really good recyclers on station because it's very expensive and difficult to put things in orbit. I think space station is also, or space programs also, are very important because they promote international cooperation. Things that big, things that difficult require more than the resources of one nation. And it's a great opportunity for us to learn to work together in peaceful endeavors. The space station is a great example of that. It's nearly a 1 million pound mass, and it is spectacular. The pictures, I don't think, do it justice. You really have to almost be there. And if you ever get a chance to go outside and climb around on the outside of that structure, it'll take your breath away. It's just spectacular. Space exploration also opens new frontiers to exploration and settlement. If you look at the history of the Earth, the 4 billion year history of this planet, it's a history filled with extinctions and catastrophic events. And it probably would behoove us as a species long term to have more than one place to call home. And then I think most importantly for our future, for all of us, for the future of the space station program, future of the space programs in general, and the future of the human race, is to inspire the next generation of explorers, some of which I hope are in this room right now. So this is a little bit about space station to give you a pictorial view. If you could very gently set it on the ground, on top of a soccer field or football field, it would spill over the end zones. It is huge. Total mass spacecraft of the space station is nearly 1 million pounds, as I mentioned, 450,000 kilograms. It travels at the magic speed of 28,000 kilometers per hour, 17,000 miles an hour, which is what you have to travel if you're orbiting an 8,000-mile rock like planet Earth. It's about 400 kilometers above the surface of the Earth in a place we call low Earth orbit. It's not the kind of vehicle you'd be able to take to the moon, certainly not the kind of vehicle you'd be able to take to Mars, but it's going to help us to a great extent be able to pave the way to those kinds of destinations again. And it's a world-class facility. So from the standpoint of advancing science and technology, it's really, really important, I think, to try to do things that are really difficult. And space exploration is one of those. Just the propulsion technology to be able to put enough energy into a payload, into a human being, into the food and water that crews need on orbit, into the science experiments you're going to do. It takes basically the best brains that we have to be able to design engine systems, propulsion systems that can withstand tremendous temperatures and pressures. And there's very minimal margin. There's not the ability to just weld on an extra chunk of metal on something to make it stronger. It pushes the limits of finite element analysis and things like that to be able to optimize to the finest degree the structure of rockets and spacecraft. So you're really pushing the boundaries there, and doing all of that helps us a great deal. It's really expensive to put stuff in orbit, so the things you put up there, you'd like to make them as small as possible. That goes for the computers, it goes for the life support systems and everything else. It teaches you to be an uber recycler. You don't want to waste anything. For every pound of payload that you put in space, whether it's a pound of me, my spacesuit, a science payload that's going to be up there, every pound of that takes 20 to 25 pounds of high explosive propellant and rocket structure to get it into space. So you'd like to make sure that you use and reuse again everything that you have up there. So we can learn some great lessons about taking care of our planet by doing that sort of thing. Clean power generation is key. It helps us advance things like robotics. We're learning an awful lot, certainly as American astronauts, about hardware serviceability and reliability. So some of the things that we do up there are what I would categorize as basic research, basic science. So fluids behave very counterintuitively. In fact, in general, space station is truly an outpost in a frontier. And in frontiers, things don't behave the way we're used to seeing. You can't really follow your intuition. So liquids, for example, absent the force of gravity, are basically dominated by capillary action and surface tension, as opposed to the inertial forces of the liquid. So a liter of water will happily form a perfect sphere and float in front of you. Or if you disturb it, it'll split off into hundreds of spheres going who knows where. This is really important for us because we're learning about how to design microfluidics, medical systems. We're learning how to design the geometry of tanks, learning about the surface properties of materials, the wetting properties of materials, so that we can passively get fluid to go from one point to another to save energy, for example. Combustion behaves very, very differently in space as well. Absent the gravity-induced convection forces that tend to want to make the rising combustion products provide a path for clear air or oxygen to basically come at the base of a flame and can sustain it. Absent that, flames will tend to snuff themselves out, or more sinisterly, sometimes flames will end up being super cool to the point you can't even see them. You can have something that's smoldering and very, very slowly burning, and that piece of burning droplet of fluid, for example, could migrate its way to some place you wouldn't want it to be and potentially cause a fire to propagate. So in some senses, certain kinds of materials and in certain kinds of conditions, flames are a little bit self-limiting, but in another way, they're a little bit more sinister in that they can migrate to places and cause other kinds of problems. Different kinds of materials. The way that flames burn in fluid, in microgravity, where you can remove the effects of gravity-induced convection, are telling us a lot about just the basic physics of combustion that has a lot of applicability for fuel efficiency in vehicles and even power efficiency in industrial production plants. We're pushing the limits of materials technology on space station as well. The space station flies in an area where it's vulnerable to micrometeoroid hypervelocity impacts. So we've got to, and it's also in a very high radiation environment. You also have the extremes in pressure and extremes in temperature. The temperature swings will be plus or minus 100 degrees centigrade, and they can happen and the temperature gradient is extremely stark. So designing materials that can number one, withstand ballistic impacts, that can withstand temperature extremes without excessively contracting or expanding, and can withstand, potentially do some shielding for the radiation environment is critical. And that has a lot of applicability elsewhere. When you go to space, your body changes. One of the things that happens is absent exercise, we're going to lose bone mass at about 10 times the rate of somebody who diagnosed with osteoporosis. So the theory of you lose it or use it or you lose it is very much in effect in space. So the key is you got to make sure that you exercise a lot. Nutrition, certain kinds of nutrition, plenty of calcium, plenty of vitamin D is key as well. We've got a great machine right here that Tolia is demonstrating how to exercise. This is basically an entire world-class gym that you might run into here that's open 24 hours a day with a whole host of machines, and this will generate loads up to 600 pounds, which Tolia, unlike me, can probably actually move. But it's really key to get into the multiple hundred pounds to load certain key parts of your body, the hips and the lower spine being part of that, to be able to minimize the loss of bone. So we're finding now with this piece of equipment and being very careful about nutrition that what used to be deemed as a showstopper to deep space exploration, that is bone loss, is actually perhaps not nearly a problem at all for us. So crews are coming back in nearly as good condition as they were before they left. Cardiovascular, cardiopulmonary capacity is still a little bit of a problem. You know, we exercise on space station 2.5 hours a day, an hour of cardio, and it'll be on this treadmill, which I like, or this cycle ergometer, which I absolutely do not like. And we'll also do about an hour and a half of strength training every single day, and it's job one. You have to do it. And if you do that, you'll come back and your muscle strength will be better than it was before you left. Your power capacity will be better than it was before you left. But in my experience, cardiovascular, your stamina from a cardiovascular standpoint is still reduced a little bit, but it comes back fairly quickly. And we're in much better shape than we ever were during shuttle missions for the short duration flights. A lot of interesting things are happening, we're discovering, with the geometry of the eye. In some crew members, there's some globe flattening, and we think it might be associated with elevated cerebral spinal fluid, perhaps. But we're actually seeing swelling in the back and the optic nerve, and potentially changes in the morphology of the eye itself, and actually issues with choroidal folds on the retina. So these are really big deals that we have to sort out. There is a corollary kind of a disease, kind of an issue that certain people have on planet Earth, where we are learning things about bone loss that's helping us treat, or helping us understand better how to treat people with osteoporosis. We may be learning some things about how to treat this issue with the eyes that'll help people as well. But for some folks, after long duration space flight, 10 or 15% or so, there'll be a degradation in the visual acuity that we right now can't seem to get corrected. So that's an ongoing area of study. Your brain rewires itself to a certain degree when you're in space. We live in a world that's governed by the force of gravity that makes everything want to fall. If we lose something, it goes down on the XY plane of the floor, but it never is a problem for us in Z. So if you're working in a shop and a socket comes off the ratchet, it goes skittering underneath the workbench, at least it's limited to the plane of the floor. In space, that's absolutely not the problem. Things go in whatever direction they want to go, and it's usually the direction you're least likely to think of at the time. We are crowded. We sense our space, our living space, by the two-dimensional space that we walk around in. This room right here, we could easily have 10 times as many people that could be occupying all the space above our heads right now, and it would be no more crowded than it is right now. In microgravity, that'd be possible. When you first get to space, everybody on space station, everybody on space shuttles tends to shuffle around on little foot loops, soft foot loops or handrails on the floor, and they behave and they walk as if that thing was sitting on planet Earth. And then after about a week for most people, suddenly something in your brain just switches and you realize, you know, I want to go work up here. I'm just going to flip upside down, or I'm going to do a hang like a bat from the ceiling, and I'll work on this bolt over here, or I'll go ahead and put my hands in a glove box upside down so it's a little bit more logical. And in your perception, the volume of the space station just suddenly increases by about 50%. After a period of time, you'll be working on space station, you'll be talking to somebody for 10 minutes, and it will not even occur to you that their head is upside down relative to you. And so it's amazing to me how quickly we adapt, and you know, we've spent a million years growing and learning how to be terrestrial-bound organisms, but in space we very happily learn to be able to navigate and think and operate in a three-dimensional world seamlessly. So we learned a lot about medical diagnostic equipment and also treatment. Historically, a lot of things that we use and we take for granted right now in the way of medical diagnostics, from EKGs and Holter monitors and pulmonary monitors, heart rate monitors, all kinds of things like that, all came as a direct spin-off from the space program. But space also, microgravity also affords the opportunity to actually design medications, design treatments specifically to target a specific ailment. So we can grow against sedimentation and the gravity-induced forces of convection. We can grow crystals that are very, very large. And crystals of protein have very complicated 3D structures, and all the proteins, the thousands of them, and all of our bodies that regulate everything about how we how we live and how we feel. All those things are a very specific shape and size. If you grow crystal of that big enough, you can use X-ray diffraction techniques and basically discern the exact shape in 3 dimensions of what that is. And so that allows scientists to actually design a medication to actually interact directly with a receptor, for example, and generate something that has exactly the right kind of geometry for it. So there's some really exciting things that are coming out from space station research that help with that. In space, in general, the human immune system gets suppressed a little bit. And unfortunately, a lot of microbes become hyperactive. They end up increasing in their virulence or their ability to infect and cause disease. They increase in their growth rate, and also antibiotic resistance sometimes increases. That's not true for all of them. Some of them have different effects, and some of them actually become depressed. But in the case of salmonella, for example, it becomes pretty sinister up there. And by studying exactly what was changing in salmonella and understanding how the genes of that microbe are being expressed in microgravity and how that changes relative to Earth has allowed people here on planet Earth right now to design a very promising vaccine that would prevent salmonella. And it's I think the #3 killer for children and babies in third world regions, for example. So that has a lot of promise. Similar testing right now is ongoing for MRSA and also for Streptococcus. We've got a great robotic arm on station. Actually, we've got several robotic arms. One of them we have is about 80 feet long, and it's got it's symmetric. The piece that attaches on space station here on the laboratory is exactly the same as this one, and it can operate like an inchworm. It can attach to the space station in one place, power itself up from this one, and it can use this, grapple to a different place, let go here, and inchworm its way from one place to another. It can hold loads that are up to 200,000 pound mass. And it's designed for the radiation environment of space. It's also made out of carbon composite. It doesn't have a lot of metal in it. And thinking about that afterwards, we use it, by the way, to fly ourselves around outside space station. It does a great job at that. We use it to catch satellites with payloads. And now that same technology is being used to actually design a set of robot arms that can actually do surgery, guided surgery, remotely guided surgery by a surgeon elsewhere while the patient is inside an MRI machine. So it allows to do minimally, absolutely minimally invasive surgery to remove, for example, in this case, a brain tumor from a patient. Even when things don't go right in space, because it's so tough, we still end up learning some things. When the Hubble Space Telescope was launched in 1990, it was discovered that its primary mirror was shaped like a sphere instead of shaped like a parabola. A parabola will focus parallel light rays to a point, and a sphere will not. And this was just an oversight in the initial design of the Hubble Space Telescope. So when astronomers first started looking at imagery, they were seeing things like this when they expected to see that. Now the good news in Hubble was it was misfigured, but it was misfigured so perfectly that it was very easy to generate a set of essentially eyeglasses to correct that spherical aberration and make the resulting images be focused by a combined set of optics that generated the equivalent of a parabolic mirror. But in the intervening 3 years, astronomers wanted to do a lot of work with the Hubble. So they found ways of basically taking this imagery and processing it with mathematical techniques and using that to generate usable images like this. Now you've seen the Hubble images of the Pinwheel galaxy, for example, and they're much more crisp than this, but this is still a far cry from that. And it turns out those same algorithms that were used on Hubble apply directly for diagnostic imagery analysis for mammography. So you can do mammography and not have to actually do surgery and be able to do an awful lot of good. So even when things don't go quite right, we learn a lot. Earth observation, remote sensing. The space station is only 240 miles or so, 400 kilometers or so above the surface of the Earth. And the Earth is relatively close to us, and we've got some great cameras up there that allow us to do a lot of great imagery from there. These are just a few of the cameras that we have. This is the cupola. It's like a window on the world. It's a bubble, a glass. It's got 6 circumferential windows and another circular one at the very nadir part of station. And you can see 2,000 miles in all directions all around you. And we've also got some phenomenal cameras that are like telescopes. And it takes us a while. The cameras are very fast, but those lenses are still so sensitive, and the space station's moving at 8 kilometers a second, that even if the shutter's open for a thousandth of a second or so, you still need to be able to track to be able to get a decent image. But this would be a typical Landsat image of a coral atoll in the South Pacific, where they're concerned about what's going on with the health of the coral reefs in the lagoon and the health of some of the vegetation there. This is an image that we would have gotten with the space station. Actually, I think we do better than that these days, better than 5-meter resolution. We have a pretty neat camera, a very high-end Nikon camera that we took and we modified. And we removed the filter that sits right in front of the CCD imagery chip. So all cameras basically, absent that filter, are able to see into near infrared. So they're able to give you some multispectral information that our eyes can't see. And it's actually a very useful thing. The reason why that filter is there is so the camera images that you see as your JPEGs that you see on your iPhone or whatever else, so those images look like what we expect to see. But what we did is we took that camera, we removed the infrared filter from this one, and we mounted it to an identical one, and we were able to take pictures like this. So you get much greater contrast, and you get very specific information, at least a 3-band multispectral data about the health of vegetation and even the health of coral reefs, for example. So this would be with a normal camera, take that filter off, and this is what you'd see. The contrast goes up, and you also get very, very important information that help planning from an agricultural standpoint, and also for the scientists, marine biologists that work on the health of the reefs. So these are center point pivot farms that are in Saudi Arabia. Those dark blotches you see there, and then in the infrared, that's what they look like. And the color of the red, the shade of the red, tells you something about the crop, number one, and the health of the crop. And this is Mount Kilimanjaro. So it's not just coral reefs and whatnot, but it tells you a lot about plant life in general. When disasters happen like hurricanes, we can get imagery like this from a satellite that's 22,000 miles away at geosynchronous orbit, or we can get a close-up image that gives you a different perspective from the height of 240 miles. This is a sandstorm in Qatar, marching across the desert. It's a couple hundred feet tall. And you have a great vantage point for things like that. This is an incredibly huge sandstorm that probably covered 3,000 kilometers and stayed lofted thousands of feet up into the air for the better part of 2 weeks, covering Iran. These are noctilucent clouds. These are clouds that are much, much higher than the top of the troposphere, and they're clouds that are still high enough to be still illuminated by the sun. These have some we believe these are almost like the canaries in the coal mine for global health, global climate change, and so forth. And as time has gone on, we see more and more of these, and we have a great vantage point. You can see them from low Earth orbit much easier than you can from high up. We can use the imagery sensors and cameras that we have to monitor the health of glaciers. And this is Viedma Glacier down in Patagonia. And for shipping purposes, we can easily keep track of the ice as it breaks up in the spring over Kamchatka, for example. When there are floods in the Amazon, we see it. We have a window seat for all of that. Sometimes when the sun glint is there, you can see incredible detail of all the different rivulets in which villages are inundated. In Madagascar, there's a river called the Betsaboka River, which essentially is now all inundated with red soil. Most of the vegetation in Madagascar, the trees have all been cut down, and so there's no roots to hold the soil together, and all that reddish clay is literally bleeding out into the ocean. Down in the Amazon in Brazil, there's a lot of clear cutting going, where the rainforest is being cleared out to make to basically collect trees and whatnot, and so we can actually monitor that pretty well real time and give that information to people who are managing the land use. When there are fires, sometimes in huge extent, thousands of miles all over Australia, or in this case Mexico, you get a great vantage point to be able to keep an eye on that from station. Volcanoes, we have an entirely different perspective at 240-mile altitude than do high altitude, either planes down low or high altitude satellites. So you get a lot of information about the vertical extent of the initial plume. Here, this is Mount Etna when it was very, very active about 10 years ago, and you could see where every one of the vents are exhausting. Oh, 1 second. There we go. And then within a couple seconds, you can zoom out and show exactly where that plume is drifting all the way across the Mediterranean, finding its way to Algeria and Libya. Zooming in with some of those longer lenses at Mount St. Helens, for example, would show you this. So for 4 billion years, particularly in the early stages, Earth was bombarded with comets, with asteroids, meteorites, and there's very little evidence of that in our planet, in our geological record, because of plate tectonics, which erases all that periodically. But Comet Shoemaker-Levy in 1994 got tidally torn apart as it passed close by Jupiter, and then after a pass around the Sun, came back and actually impacted Jupiter. And these scars it left on the surface of the cloud tops on Jupiter were 3 Earths in diameter across. Incredible amount of energy. And if we look on planet Earth from space, we also see evidence of some relatively young, 2 million or so year old crater impacts like that of a couple kilometers across. And sometimes you'll see some really, really big ones like this, which is Manicouagan in Canada. And if you look closely, out here are actually the Clear Lake craters right here, which are even a bigger radius than Manicouagan. This here probably would have wiped out all life on a continental scale. So those things happen, and they happen relatively frequently from the standpoint of the life of the planet Earth, for example. Now, sometimes we use space station to actually affect a rescue, and coming back from my past life as a Coast Guard helicopter pilot, this is a little near and dear to me. We have an antenna on space station called an Ais Receiver. AIS is Automatic Information System. It's like a tracking system that airplanes use, but we also use it on ships. And the thing is, it's line of sight. So for all the shore stations, they're only able to see about 7 to 10 miles offshore, depending on the height of the mast of the ship. But on space station, so they're only seeing maybe 5% of all the vessel traffic. But from space station, this thing right here is picking up 30,000 ship contacts every single day on space station. In one case, it caught the contact and the information about a fishing vessel that sank in the far North Atlantic in ice with 4 people. One survivor was left, and that survivor was rescued after 4 hours after the ship went down, and it was just because of that. It's not always disasters that we can monitor from space, but we can also monitor some good things as well. This is interestingly the Namib coast of Namibia, some of the most barren, desolate, difficult to live in climate in the entire world. In fact, this was called the Skeleton Coast hundreds of years ago, when if anybody ever made landfall there, your likelihood of being able to survive in there was virtually zero. And as barren and desolate as this is, just offshore sometimes you'll see huge plankton blooms that are as the water wells up from Antarctica, and then now you've got millions of tons of living mass right there. So ironically, the contrast is so stark between virtually lifeless to incredibly full of life. And for the standpoint of fisheries and so forth and fisheries management, that's really great information. So one of the biggest things that helps us with space is the tyranny of the rocket equation. I said we live on an 8,000-mile rock, planet Earth, and we hover. Space station doesn't actually hover. It flies around at about 240 or 250 miles. We're still under the force of gravity. And at 8,000, with an 8,000-mile rock, the force of gravity is strong enough that the only way to stay in orbit, so you can be fired out from a cannon at 1,000 miles an hour and to have an arc like this, or maybe at 2,000 miles an hour and have an arc like that, or at 17,500 miles an hour, you'd be able to stay in orbit, which is basically what we have to do. So that's the Earth. Our next nearest target is the Moon. The Moon is 1,000 times further away than space station is right now. But the space station flies fast enough, it's actually covering the distance to the Moon in about 3/4 of a day. We do 17 laps of the Earth, 16 to 17 laps of the Earth every single day. But that is a long way to go. And we don't have warp drives or dilithium crystals or anything like that to be able to do it. We do it in a rather crude way right now as human beings. And as high-tech as this is, and it's one of the best liquid rocket engines ever designed, it's the Space Shuttle main engine. It generates about 500,000 pounds of thrust. It is very crude in the sense that all it's doing is taking liquid or taking hydrogen, H2, and O2, and it's rearranging those atoms to create H2O in a slightly lower energy state, and the excess energy ends up being heat, which takes that water and puts it into steam and kicks it out real fast. And then through Newton's third law, that's how we move spaceships. But it's just the rearranging of electron bonds that allows us to do that. But it pushes the limits of the technology to be able to make something that withstands a temperature like the surface of the sun inside of here, and 1 million or 500,000 pounds of thrust, and doesn't come apart. So this is tough technology, but it's still kind of like the baby stages of spacefaring people in a certain sense. Anyway, so when Saturn V and Apollo 11 took these three guys, Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin, to the Moon in 1969, the only thing that made it back was this capsule, which weighs about 6 tons, half as much as the Orion capsule that just flew a couple weeks ago, by the way. And these guys, they needed 33 bottles of oxygen, basically. They needed 4 jugs of water, about like that, and they needed about this much food to be able to do it. And so the tyranny of the rocket equation says basically that only 4 to 8% of the starting weight makes it to orbit. As great as those engines are, all that fuel gets used up in very short order, and the only thing that can ever make its way back is this itty-bitty piece on top. So that makes it expensive to fly in space, and it's the same whether you're flying a proton rocket with an FGB, the functional cargo block, the first module of space station, or a space shuttle. It's all pretty much the same. That drives us to being great recyclers. So what we try to do is we try to close the life support loop as best we can, and we get fairly close with it right now. So what we do is we take all the waste water and the waste oxygen that comes out of a crew member, and the water that comes out as pre-treated urine goes into a urine processor. The wastewater bus collects all the humidity out of the air, the humidity that we exhale if we're working out and sweat, and all that humidity, the stuff that ends up in the towels that end up getting dried, all of that gets collected by dehumidifiers, and it runs in basically and intercepts the same stream outside of the urine processor. And then it goes into a water processing assembly that has a whole host of really complicated equipment to eventually kick out potable water that's better than any water you could get on your tap here on planet Earth. And it goes onto a potable water bus. It goes into the toilet for flushing. Some of the water we take and put it through an oxygen generator, and we take the H2O and split it up, put the oxygen back into the human and whatever payloads we have, and we take the hydrogen out of that, and we used to just throw that overboard. But now what we're doing is we're taking the hydrogen, combining it with carbon dioxide that we exhale, and we're splitting it up, and now we turn the hydrogen back into water, which gets processed into oxygen, and then the carbon from the carbon dioxide goes to form methane. So we're still slightly open loop. We're losing some of that stuff, but we're doing a pretty good job of reusing it. And so it means we're literally taking today's coffee and we're making it into tomorrow's coffee, and it's just fine. So this is a grossly simplified diagram of that whole system. So it's got a couple stages of water processing, and then it's got an oxygen generating system over here, and it doesn't show the Sabatier piece as well. But you spent a lot of time tinkering with this equipment. It's really complicated. It's really important. If that stops working, then very quickly we will deplete our available collections of water and have to potentially reduce the size of the crew or evacuate. So it's really important. We then take the water out of the potable water bus. We rehydrate food, and the cycle continues. So we'd also like to learn how to do this, ISRU, in situ resource utilization. If we're going to Mars, we're going to need a lot more than a 6-ton vehicle, a couple of jugs of water, and a couple of things of oxygen. It's impossible to get to Mars on anything like that scale. If the moon is 1,000 times further away than space station is, Mars is 1,000 times further away from the moon. The only way we're going to be able to operate there, and frankly, the only smart way we can operate on the moon is to use the resources that are there that are available to us. So one initial step on that is this methane piece right here. So if you're on Mars, you would use this Battier reactor. You would take CO2 out of the atmosphere of Mars, which is there, plentiful, and you would combine that with hydrogen that you'd bring or that you took off of the water that you had, and that methane would become the fuel for your rover and the fuel for your ascent stage on your Earth return vehicle. The other things that space causes us to do, it causes us to be clean power users. So we have got about 80 kilowatt continuous capability with those solar arrays and the batteries that store the energy from them. So we're essentially taking the sun's energy and we're using that to do all the things we do on space station, from the scientific research to powering our iPods, to powering everything that we do on there, to powering the oxygen generation system and the water recycling as well. 6 crew members on a 1,000,000-pound space station almost isn't enough sometimes. So we've got the first anthropoid robot in the form of Robonaut that we brought up, and we commissioned him and got him all working. And here he is. We put him to work as quickly as we could. There's some things that robots are very good at. They never get bored, and they're very precise. And they generally do what you tell them to do. Maybe more than you'd like, but anyway, so in this case, Robonaut had no mobility. He now has legs, and Robonaut can move around the space station and do whatever we tell him he needs to do, or the ground tells him he needs to do. But it's got stereoscopic vision, a couple cameras up here. Right now, he's actually testing the airflow and all these various vent grates, and he's going to add them up. He's reading it in a digital readout right here, collect all that data, and this would just drive you crazy to do that task, and he's happy as a lark. One thing for American astronauts, we never had to deal with this before. Every time we ever flew a spaceship, it either came back as a scorched capsule and we put it in a museum, or it came back as a space shuttle that was going to go back to the factory, really, and the same people who could build it, and in fact did build it in some cases, would turn around and patch it up and make it new again to fly again. But now we have a 1,000,000-pound space station that's never coming back. On the shuttle, you could get by with a little bit more than a few simple tools, duct tape, and maybe some oil or something like that. That's pretty much all you needed. But on space station, we've got to be able to do really sophisticated repairs. So we find that we can get into almost any nook and cranny, and we can do all the repairs that's needed to keep that thing flying. I think we're probably out of time. And I think maybe what I'll do is I'll just pause there and just say one more time that space pushes our comfort zone. Space pushes the technology to do the things that we do. The things that we learn in space are incredibly important to life on Earth here. And ultimately, in the long term, it's also going to be a way for us to find other homes besides just this planet Earth. So thank you very much.